Our following speaker has over 18 years of experience spanning roles in strategy consulting in cybersecurity, customer success, and nurturing new lines of business. Speaking about ditch siloed identity and access management, Convergence, a must for identity threat detection and response. Please welcome Gautam Singh, the Director of Strategic Business Engagements of ARCON.
Thank you. Very good morning to everybody. Really happy to be here. We've traveled from Mumbai and India, but this is my fourth visit to Riyadh in this year itself. So always a pleasure being here, and thank you for welcoming us to this event. As the gentleman introduced, my name is Gautam Singh. I'm the Director for Strategic Engagements at ARCON, which focuses in the space of identity-centric security solutions. And that's something we are here to talk about in terms of ditching siloed IAM when we talk about identity and access management. There are organizations that are spending millions of dollars on technologies which are siloed and disparate solutions. It could be a different MFA solution, a different IAM solution, a different PAM, enterprise vault. But really, the convergence is the key to identity threat detection and response, and that's the flavor of the presentation that we're here to talk about, right? When we talk about identity-centric security solutions, it's talking about coming to the integration of everything down to an identity, treating the identity as a perimeter of its own, right? And that's where the challenge lies, really, about why, we're talking of AI, ML, we are talking of automation. Identity also has a responsibility of ensuring that automation does not take control over human beings. It has to be the human beings having custodianship and ownership even over your service accounts, bot identities, machine identities, and any kind of interactive and non-interactive identities as well, right? So a gentleman in the earlier presentation really talked about human beings creating these identities. We've seen enough of sci-fi movies. It's not good really to see automation take control of human beings. We still need to be in control of that. So that's really the flavor of bringing in a focus of identity-centric security. So to begin with a little bit of statistics, something that the team has put together, a recent report by IBM and the Ponemon Institute talks about the cost of a data breach, right? What are we really trying to protect? We are trying to protect organizations from getting attacked through data breaches. This is the kind of business fundamentals, and the average cost of a data breach as per this report stands at about $4.35 million per breach. This is the highest that has been recorded in the last 18 years of the existence of this report. About 1 in every 5 such breaches happens due to an initial threat vector of an identity takeover, which means that an attacker is actually trying to take control over an identity to break through the controls of the organization. It's not something that a usual organization will go through once in a year or once in a lifetime. It's something that happens repeatedly. Almost 85% of organizations have experienced more than one attacks in a year, and that's the unfortunate truth of the matter, right? But what's most alarming about this report is that it took nearly 9 months on an average for any kind of breach to actually get detected and contained, which means that the attacker was within the system for a period of 9 months, probably persisting and lying low, moving around different segments to actually gain control over information, over data, and then exfiltrate that before it could even get detected. So that's how this brings in a lot of light as to why we need to protect what we are trying to protect. A few recent examples of how an identity theft or a credential attack has actually caused near devastations to organizations or even countries at large. This is an example where a hacker tried to actually poison the whole city of Florida, right? This was a case where a frontline worker was really alert, and kudos to them, because this was at a water treatment plant in Florida. There was a support session being taken in with the frontline worker, with his IT administrator. There was a man in the middle attack who took control over the session, who had the identity to actually snoop in. And what happened was, after the session, the frontline worker still noticed the mouse cursor actually moving to change the sodium hydroxide levels from 100 parts per million to 1100 parts per million. That was sufficient to actually poison a whole lot of people, right? This was kudos to the frontline worker to actually make sure that such a bio attack could be averted. What we're really talking about is that when cyber attacks happen, they are more than just business risks. There are risks to people at large, right? So the entire previous slide stops making sense when you know that the matter at hand, the problem is much larger than that. We also talk about critical infrastructure for cities, and this is an example where the Colonial Pipeline in the US was also attacked through a ransomware due to a single credential theft. And again, this was responsible for about 45% of the entire petroleum transportation in the eastern coast of the US. And the entire cities could have been brought to ransom. They got away cheap through a bit of a payoff probably to the attackers, but it couldn't always be the case, right? So talking of some of those examples, we also look at what organizations are spending on. I think it's a heavy amount of $13.8 billion that are just being spent on identity-centric security, be it an IAM, PAM, or user authentication market in 2022. This is a large number, but are organizations really getting the ROI out of it? Are they still feeling secure? Are CISOs still having sleepless nights or not? That's the question to be answered. This is growing at a constant CAGR of 6.6% as per Gartner's recent report, and is expected to be at $15.5 billion upwards by 2024. So it's a space that is being focused on, but I think there is lots more to do. There has to be optimization and convergence, as we talk about, rather than a siloed, disparate approach, because there are multiple problems when it comes to siloed and disparate solutions, right? You need multiple skill sets of teams to manage those. You need multiple technologies trying to come together, so there's a frictionful integration that happens. And finally, there's no single view window for organizations to understand that who has access to what and where, and what exactly are these technologies actually delivering to the organization. So that's where it becomes a point to be pondered upon. But what really is an identity? I think this in itself is becoming a little grayed in its definition, right? We don't believe that identities is only about usernames and passwords anymore. Identity is a unique persona of individuals, of applications, of even non-humans, as one could look at, right? In the human front, it really looks at your personal thoughts, your likes and dislikes, the way you go about using your information, the devices you use, the way of storage of your information, and of course your credentials as well, which is your user IDs and passwords. But that could be not just on your perimeter ecosystem. It could be on the cloud. It could be on your digital virtual ecosystems as well. So when you look at this, the business models are changing now and are becoming more outcome-driven, hyper-personalized, and there's a sense of access versus ownership and identifying those in itself, right? So at ARCON, we believe that it's not only about protecting data or privacy, which of course is very important, but also the ideas or the thought processes and our own future existence, because at the end of it, as I started off with saying, there needs to be a control of humans over the automation and not the other way around. We all have our presence in the digital ecosystem, in the virtual world, I'm sure in social media, in cloud platforms, in all kinds of applications that maybe they're exposed to the world at large. So we have our own presence there. Don't we want to protect ourselves? So what are the analysts and regulators saying? I read through a little bit of this. Of course, we are aware of global standards when it comes to various industry verticals or industry standards like ISO or any kind of standards that are like the GDPR or NIST. Even in Saudi Arabia, the SAMA and NCA have very progressive controls for cybersecurity, and I would like to applaud the initiatives taken by the government in this line, because I've been working closely in this market for the last 5 to 7 years, and I've seen the kind of proactiveness that is there in ensuring that protection is center stage and is important. So some of the objectives of even SAMA as well as NCA talk about sufficient access privileges, identity being the center stage of security, identity being the new perimeter, and of course, zero trust, SASE controls, and identity threat detection and response also taking importance or cognizance of that. If we look at the last 25 odd years and see how evolution of identity landscapes have happened, right? It started off with an approach of network domains, weak passwords, weak reuse of passwords. So no strong controls around that. The trends were around local identities and mainframes and PCs as the core infrastructure that was there. It's moved in the last, if you look at 5 to 15 years ago, that decade saw the advent of more smart card authentication, enterprise active directories, so a little more structure in that, but that still had a challenge of credential theft attacks or even mass password compromises because they were maintained as plain texts, right? There was no system to actually manage and randomize or rotate those kind of passwords. But there was advent of single sign-on, two-factor authentication, and a more structured framework to your infrastructure in terms of data centers and mobile devices. But if you look at the last 3 to 5 years and right up to present, I think the entire ecosystem has evolved at a much more exponential form. We have Active Directories on the cloud, Azure Active Directories. We have passwordless authentication. I mean, people are moving away from passwords, so passwordless, data center-less, zero trust access control, SASE environments for infrastructure. And of course, with that comes security measures like CASP or ZTNA that are required in today's day and age. And of course, a hybrid and federated cloud identity that also forms the construct of having a converged cloud, converged identity platform on the whole. So where does the need for a zero trust come in? If you look at the cycle of a typical cyber attack, there would be an initial access, right? A threat attacker would like to take control, enter the ecosystem of the organization through the largest attack surface, which would typically be an end user. It could be your infrastructure devices. Those are easier and also areas where probably the organization lacks in terms of cultural and human mindset, right? The training and sensitization of end users at times is seen to be lacking, and thus the proactiveness in protecting that may be a problem, and that makes it an easy door for attackers to come in. Then typically you would find them persisting, laying low, snooping around to see how the ecosystem functions and where can they get access to any kind of privileged escalations. Moving that, once they get any kind of privileged identity control, is where they can get access to multiple credentials, multiple usernames and passwords, even open up ports or configurations for external threat vectors to come in. And that's when things start going out of control for the organization, right? Or for nations at large, if you look at it, from a cybersecurity infrastructure perspective. This is where now, after gaining that kind of configuration control, they are able to move laterally across user segments, identity segments, even infrastructure segments, or cloud infrastructure in itself. They really have control over the entire infrastructure of that organization's assets. And finally, they are then in control of everything for data exfiltration. I think that's a little too late in the game now. It's more of a negotiation in terms of a ransomware control that one could look at. One really doesn't want to get there. One wants to actually look at areas on the top, step 1 and 2, to actually proactively prevent and protect, and that's where automation comes in play. I think the kind of information that organizations have, it's going to be impossible to do such protective mechanisms manually. That's where automation comes in control, and the positives of automation need to be applied. So from a zero trust point of view, the strategy of a zero trust talks about 3 key pillars, and which is around verifying explicitly, a least privileged access control, and assuming that a breach would happen, how really would you bounce back? So do you have resiliency controls in play as well? So when we look at solutions, it's in our design thinking to actually think of each of these pillars. It could mean having explicit authentication and authorization perspectives in that, having geolocation controls, least privilege or just-in-time access controls, right? If someone needs to do a particular elevated task, what is the minimum privileges that would be required by them to actually carry out that task? And what is the minimum time that is required for them to actually have that privilege in itself? These are elements that need to be looked at. But the third pillar talks about the hard fact of the matter, and that is that even after every proactive measure, a breach eventually happens, right? So how do you really bounce back and have resiliency controls in place? You've got to have visibility analytics for leadership to actually have investigative controls, fraud investigation mechanisms, and you have to have AI/ML-driven anomaly threat detection and response solutions that can preempt the pattern and recognize patterns of any kind of a threat happening so that it doesn't happen again. So Gartner talks about an ecosystem of ITDR, which is Identity Threat Detection and Response. It's a 9-point elemental framework that really focuses around identity-centric security, a lot of which I talked about, right? It has to span between your critical identities, critical IT assets, human identities, and non-human identities, right? So we at ARCON also look at 3 key pillars of that regard, starting from human identities, and digital assets. The digital identities and digital assets need to be mapped back onto human identities, and all of this control needs to be across your critical IT asset infrastructure, your data centers, and also your endpoints and cloud infrastructures. We believe that convergence is the key, just as Gartner have also been talking about, that by 2025, 70+% of new access management deployments will be converged in nature and not the erstwhile siloed and disparate solutions. So when convergence is at key, this is the thought process behind what are the functional aspects that need to come in play. There are different types of identities that need to be managed. These could be your privileged, non-privileged, business identities, machine identities, service accounts, bots, APIs, applications, so on and so forth, interactive and non-interactive in nature. There has to be an element of zero trust with authentication, passwordless controls, and just-in-time access. A virtual access platform with the new age environments of remote working cultures where your data is actually beyond your perimeters. You need to have control mechanisms such that remote access can be taken off end users from your central IT support control desk. And this should be able to integrate into your cloud infrastructure assets, your data centers, endpoint devices, business applications, and also your directory structures, which is any kind of single source of truth, your Active Directories, your HRMS systems, as well as have a vaulted approach to ensure that there is encryption protection to best defense-grade encryption solutions or secrets governance, right? Starting from your SSH crypto keys, SSL certificates, or even your passwords for that matter. All of these need to converge into a platform with an elemental base of governance and administration for identities that will help organizations understand who has access to what and where, and what is all the infrastructure really returning in terms of the investments made. That being said, we believe that identity-centric security will be built on convergence of IAM, PAM, IGA with contextual data models. And by contextual data models, I mean that it should be able to understand not just what the data is, but the context of the information. For example, if I recognize a legal case file document within the organization, I may classify it as sensitive, but who is the custodian of that? A legal case file document lying with the legal head of the organization, not an anomaly. But the same data lying with, say, another user such as an IT support or a receptionist, it's an anomaly. the person, based on the role, does not have any business of having that particular information, right? So there has to be role-based, user-driven, user context, data context brought into automation, and that's the thought process that lies around contextual data models, wherein this could really be the preemptive automated way of anomaly threat detection and response. With that, I'd like to wrap up this point of conceptual note, and I hope it's been insightful. I'd love to interact with all of you in course of today and tomorrow. Please enjoy the show.